You are listening to the Air Raid Hour with host Judge Mathis, dog, Tilt Money, dog, presented by the fine folks over at the Cover One Sports Network, dogs. Bills Mafia, let's go!
Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen, to the Air Raid Hour. My name is Steve Mathis. You can find me on Twitter at Judge Mathis, joined as always by my co-host Dave Tilton. You can find him on Twitter at Tilt Money. Together we are the Bills guys. This is the Air Raid Hour presented by Picasso's Pizza and the Cover One Sports Network. So it's been quite a newsworthy week in the National Football League between, the likes of Derek Carr this week, a whole bunch of different players getting released this week. And Dave, you obviously missed last week as well. And in this sort of time frame between last week and this week, the Buffalo Bills now find themselves technically without a defensive coordinator, with Leslie Frazier making the decision to step away. Now, I know a whole bunch of other Cover One sort of shows have touched on this already, but I'm going to get your thoughts and I'm going to share mine real quick here on the departure of Leslie Frazier.
Well, on one hand, you can look at it and say the timing maybe is a little odd that it took this time to kind of like make this decision. I do feel like reading between the lines, it was probably like a decision made out of respect probably for Leslie Frazier, because like as it hasn't been definitively stated, it didn't say he was coming back to the Bills in 2024 necessarily. It just said he was taking off coaching for a year. And I will say this about the decision, right? Like a lot of people were wanting there to be a change at the coordinator position, specifically the defensive coordinator position at the end of the season. And this, in a way, I think was kind of a good move by the Bills, because they kind of waited, let the kind of news cycles die down, let the season, like the sting of the end of the season kind of wear off a bit, and then kind of go about this in a way that was like a little well thought out, right? It wasn't necessarily like a knee-jerk reaction to how the season ended, even though I think in their heart of hearts, the Bills felt like just, changing, like bringing in like a defensive assistant is not really going to move the needle that much. So with rumors swirling around that Sean McDermott may take over play calling for this year, I think that may get some of the decision-making back in the good graces of Bills fans, even though technically they haven't really hired a new defensive coordinator. So very interesting approach by the Bills here.
Yeah. To me, I some people argue this is a blessing in disguise. Some people argue you get what you wish for. I'm more for on the blessing in disguise sort of end of the spectrum here in terms of like my reaction to the news. Now, I don't want to sort of, stomp on or trash the things that Leslie Frazier has done for the organization, because he's been a very good defensive coordinator, especially during the regular season for this football team. And this defense has shown up in the playoffs, thinking, Teron Johnson and that Baltimore game specifically come to mind a couple of years ago. So Leslie Frazier is, and when he does decide to return to the National Football League, will be a good defensive coordinator. But sometimes there are good coaches and sometimes there are good coordinators, and sometimes it's just time to mutually part ways and to maybe bring in a fresh voice or a different perspective. And it's not exactly like Sean McDermott's a fresh voice or a fresh perspective, but Eric Turner has pointed out, going back to 2017, when early on in Sean McDermott's tenure, when he got a little frustrated at a certain number of things, he would take over play calling for spurts. And in those spurts that Sean McDermott would take over play calling, the defense would be more aggressive. And I think you're seeing a large number of Bills fans over the course of this offseason start to direct their anger, not at the coordinators, not the players, but at Sean McDermott. And we saw and we heard a loud number of people on social media saying like, oh, I wish we would have went after Sean Payton, or man, Sean McDermott's going to be the next Marvin Lewis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not saying any of those things are true or the Bills should have done those things, but I will say this. Now this defense is 100% in Sean McDermott's hands. Sean McDermott essentially sort of controls his own destiny here with the way this defense is going to operate. And I think that is I think that's the blessing, is now we know like this is Sean McDermott calling the shots, and it rests 100% on his shoulders.
Yeah, I agree. And it certainly doesn't look like, based on the news coming out and what we've heard around the news about Sean McDermott likely taking over play calling, like there's not a defensive coordinator coming in. Like, it's just like,
Yeah.
like the chances of the Bills actually bringing in someone now, like, out of house to do this, like, is slim to none to me from what I'm seeing. And so, um, there's no hiding behind there's no scapegoating at this point. If you're Sean McDermott, like, this is going to be your show, and we'll see if you as a head coach are willing to either evolve or kind of go back to some of the things that made
Yeah.
this defense really good when you were the one calling the shots. So going to be really interesting to see.
And I think Al Holcomb, who comes over from Carolina, and one of the things that they did in Carolina, even though Al Holcomb is familiar with Sean McDermott and that scheme, they've worked together previously, or at least there's connections. I'm not 100% sure if they've worked together before, but I know that they have mutual connections, guys like Steve Wilkes, etc. But Al Holcomb blitzed a lot more in Carolina than the Buffalo Bills did this year. So maybe Al Holcomb brings that perspective to this defense. Maybe this defense gets a little bit better at blitzing, is able to do that more, and adds that tool, sort of the tool belt next season. And if Sean McDermott is calling plays, he's always been sort of the CEO head coach. He now has a guy like Al Holcomb there as well to do some of maybe the grunt work that Leslie Frazier was doing during the week while Sean McDermott was concentrating on that CEO stuff. So even though Al Holcomb is only like a senior defensive analyst, I think he's going to play a large role in the way this defense operates this season. Before we get into the combine, because that's going to be our major focus for tonight, going position by position at the NFL combine, talking about risers, talking about fallers, talking about guys who maybe stayed exactly where they are and just move their draft position slightly. I want to talk a little bit about the free agent market, because a guy became available today. Minnesota released Eric Kendricks. A lot of people on social media were very loud, like he's washed. More in the category of Minnesota switched their defense. He'd be a much better fit in a defense like the Buffalo Bills. We've seen Bobby Wagner released. We've seen Frank Clark released. Robert Woods released. John Johnson released. There are a number of quality football players, quality veteran football players. Leonard Floyd is probably going to end up on the chopping block, that are going to be on the free agent market now, starting now and then starting next week as well. And I want to get your thoughts on this, because I'm all about the compensatory pick bingo at this point, because if Tremaine Edmonds walks in free agency, if Jordan Poyer walks in free agency, even if Jordan Phillips maybe walks, or Shaq Lawson walks and gets a good deal, tie goes to the player who was released. Like, if it comes down to, do you want Bobby Wagner or Eric Kendricks? I'm probably taking Eric, or I'm sorry, not, it comes down to like Bobby Okereke or Eric Kendricks. Like, I'm going with Eric Kendricks, because Bobby Okereke would count against that compensatory pick formula, whereas Eric Kendricks would not. And the Buffalo Bills can start accumulating assets for the future as we move into the next phase of sort of our franchise build. What are your thoughts on that? Should that be something that's a focal point of a team's organizational strategy? I know the Baltimore Ravens have utilized that a lot. Or should the Buffalo Bills just be going and looking for the best possible fit, the best possible player?
Well, I think they should be going looking for the best possible player, but I think if all things are equal and you're kind of undecided maybe, or you view two players about equally, I think it would make team building sense to go after the guy that isn't going to cost you from a compensatory pick standpoint. And so from that standpoint, guys that are getting released, veterans, solid veterans, like, let's be real, like Eric Kendricks, Bobby Okereke, like, how much is one guy moving the needle to the level of like a Tremaine Edmonds or a Levante David over the other? Probably not, right? You're talking about losing, a top 5 linebacker potentially in Tremaine Edmonds for, now you're getting into like what, maybe like a top 25, top 30 guy at that point. Like, how much really difference is there between these guys? To me, it's negligible. And then from that standpoint, I'd rather take the guy who's not going to cost you from a compensatory standpoint. So I think it's smart team building. And I also think, knowing the Bills only have 6 picks this year, and knowing that they're going to be coming up against some pretty big dollars, cap hits in the coming years with Josh Allen and Von Miller and Stephon Diggs, restructuring potentially happening with some of the contracts to try to free up cap space for the immediate future, but will set up a tougher cap down the road. It makes sense, right? That you can then replenish some of your, middle to bottom of your roster talent with draft picks. So I'm all for that approach at this point.
Yeah, looking at the Buffalo Bills roster construction at this point, we are 1 week away from the start of the tampering period. It's going to start to get hot and heavy this week in terms of, I think, Buffalo Bills news, because the Buffalo Bills still are like $20 million above the salary cap. So you're going to see some moves over the course of this week for the Buffalo Bills to start to free up some money. There's some really good comments going on in the comment section. Charles G is like, hey, let's go get Bobby Trees. Randy Harbin's like, no, let's go draft and find the next Bobby Trees. And that's sort of where it's going to get really interesting before the draft even starts, because Brandon Beane, typically, with the exception of cornerback last year, has always been like, we need to go out, we need to find someone who's a veteran who can at least be a serviceable starter at every position. So we're not drafting for need, we are drafting for best player available when we pick. But he's also said in some of his press conferences this year, or he said in this press conference at the Combine, yeah, we might not be able to do that this year, which maybe is sort of an indication that the Bills aren't going to free up as much money as maybe, Greg and all of them did on the salary cap extravaganza, where they got the Buffalo Bills up to $50 million to play with. So it's going to be really interesting to see what route the Buffalo Bills take. They've already started it a little bit by re-signing Ike Bodker, who, I mean, if you on paper, people are going to flame me for saying this, but on paper, I think with the Ike Bodker addition, if the Buffalo Bills really needed to, they have 5 guys they could start on the offensive line week 1 of 2023 with Bodker now in the fold. So now if the Buffalo Bills do add an offensive lineman in free agency, they can go and they can do that, and their offensive line would be even stronger. But if they don't, they can draft guys to come in and compete with the Ike Buckers and the Spencer Browns of the world, and hopefully those would be higher draft picks. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the Buffalo Bills approach free agency, and it's going to get really crazy, and there's going to be some really cool conversations over the next 2 weeks.
Well, and of course, that we saw in training camp last year, so many guys got hurt across that offensive line throughout the weeks of camp. We know about Spencer Brown. Ryan Bates was out for a bit. Like Mitch Moore. Like we had guys in and out all throughout camp. So you can't necessarily just be like, these are 5 guys we're going to have for all of camp.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't really work that way. So I think they're going to have to sign. They're obviously going to have to sign more guys. And I liked what you said on social media the other day about having 10 linemen on the roster potentially this year to start the season, because man, like they really need to get this offensive line right. One of the best conversations right now happening across social media amongst Bills fans is like the age-old debate of is it the offensive line that's causing issues for the offense and Josh not having time in the running game, maybe not being where it needs to be, or do we need to add playmakers? And so it's a very interesting dichotomy of debate there as far as which side of the fence people land on with that one. But yeah, I mean, the cap space situation is something that we're going to have to pay very close attention to. I mean, we've got a week now until free agency tampering period opens. So things are going to have to happen quickly here pretty soon for the Bills.
Yeah, Chris Jenkins comes in and says, you don't want to be desperate for a given position when the draft comes. It's not like we're drafting the top 10. That's 100%. And I saw a couple of people on social media too pointing out like, hey, maybe the Buffalo Bills need to start drafting for need a little bit more, because drafting best player available sort of has gotten them into trouble over the past couple of years. And that if there's actually like, maybe they're not desperate at a position, but maybe like, hey, going into the season, like Ike Bodker is slated to be your starting right guard. Okay, we need to draft a guy in the first 2 rounds. So it brings you out of your comfort zone. The tie goes to the offensive lineman as opposed to the edge rusher or whatever, and the Buffalo Bills fill a more immediate hole, and it maybe helps the Buffalo Bills and saves them from themselves a little bit. So that's a conversation you can have as well.
Yeah, and I mean the NFL, I mean, I know the Eagles, look at the stats and you see like fewest amount of rookies, playing time last year snaps, but for me in the feeling of the NFL, and I'd like to see this kind of proven out with some numbers, but it's certainly, especially with receivers, right? That was always the position where you're like, oh, these guys need a couple years to develop. Like you're seeing rookies make immediate impacts now in the NFL. Like you don't have to be scared about drafting a guy and having him come in and contribute day one. Like these college programs are so well run, so organized. They're getting these guys as pro ready as they possibly can, especially in the bigger programs. Like you don't that stigma of rookies not being able to contribute right away, I think has a little bit gone by the wayside. So
all right, before we get into sort of the topic of our show tonight, the risers, the fallers, the stock watch of the NFL Combine, this show is sponsored by Picasso's Pizza. 4 great locations in Williamsville, West Seneca, Lancaster, and Blaisdell. Buffalo Pizza since 1980. You can order online at picassospizza.net. And if you're an out-of-towner like us, you can even get it mailed to your home. And I can tell you from experience, it's just as good as getting it fresh from the restaurant. Again, that is picassospizza.net. When you're feeling like, listen, free agency is coming up on Monday, you got to work, you want to get off of work, you want to come straight home, you want to you want to doom scroll Twitter, you want to turn on Cover One, you want to get up to date on all of the different free agent moves next Monday, make sure you get on over to picassospizza.net right now. Order that Picasso's Pizza. You can just throw it right in the oven, and you can have Picasso's Pizza right there for you while you are sort of taking in the first day of free agency with us next Monday. But today's show is all about the NFL Scouting Combine. And the NFL Scouting Combine, forewarning, one of the things that we always like to say, and we kind of talked about this on the last show, is that you don't want to put too much stock into a player's athletic testing, right? If a player comes out and tests really poorly, maybe that might ding them around. Like we're going to talk about Christopher Smith later from Georgia. I've always thought of Christopher Smith as a 3rd-round pick. I'm starting to think like, I don't know if I want to use a 3rd-round pick of a player of that athletic profile. Maybe that drops him to the 4th round. We're going to talk about Jordan Addison later. Maybe Jordan Addison's testing drops him to 27, and that would be a blessing for the Buffalo Bills, who can have an opportunity to grab a guy like Jordan Addison. But then there's the Bryce Ford Wheatons of the world, and I jokingly tweeted the other night, like, Bryce Ford Wheaton went from a fun developmental, like day 3 X wide receiver that we were going to talk about on our day 3 show to a 4th-round pick in about 4.38 seconds, because what he did at 6'4", 230 pounds was pretty
with
impressive.
that size.
But
yeah,
that's more like, all right, let's go back and look at the tape and see what we have there in Bryce Ford Wheaton, not let's go draft him in the 3rd round. So these are the various different conversations that we're going to have today. And then there were some bad things that happened in Indianapolis as well. Jalen Carter has dinged his draft stock. How does that affect the picks in front of the Buffalo Bills? Horrible news coming out of Indianapolis today. Andrew Voorhees, one of our favorites in this draft class, tore his ACL working out on the field, but then still managed to finish with the bench press. So that shows what a competitor that Andrew Voorhees is. And we're going to talk about him in a little bit as well. So a ton of different conversations that we're going to have tonight. We're going to go position by position. And I want to start with quarterback, right? Because I was loving what I was hearing about the quarterbacks, because the what's the word? The scuttlebutt, the conversations around a lot of insiders in Indianapolis, 4 quarterbacks in the top 10. I would love it if that happened, especially from a Buffalo Bills perspective.
Look, it's one of those situations where we were the team for 20 years hoping that the quarterback would fall, right? And that we wouldn't have to trade up. And we were the ones drafting in that kind of top 12 to 15 range and always ending up with the guy, that 3rd or 4th guy. JP Lussman comes to mind, right? Where you're like, we weren't bad enough to get the best guy, but we weren't, good enough to not need a quarterback. And so it's nice now, if you're the Bills in this position, you want as many quarterbacks to be picked ahead of you as possible. And as Pop says, Richardson tested off the charts. He's worked himself probably now into a situation where he's going to get picked before the Bills pick. I almost guaranteed that's probably going to happen now, whereas a couple of weeks ago, we might not have been saying that. So Richardson getting added to the mix with Lewis, obviously Stroud and Young. That's 4 guys that you can now see potentially going in the top 10, top 15, as you just mentioned. And a lot is going to depend on what happens with those first 2 picks, right? That's going to be where the dominoes fall. Yeah. If the first 2 teams there both take quarterbacks, if the Bears do end up trading their pick, and we obviously think the Texans have a good, strong chance to take a quarterback, then you could see 4 guys get picked in that top 10, which would be great for the Bills.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting too, because there's a lot of conversations about the quarterbacks. Geno Smith signed his extension today. Derek Carr signed with the Saints. Aaron Rodgers, that conversation is still up in the air. Rich Eisen today was talking about how the Bears are deep in talks to trade that pick, and a lot of teams who are in the quarterback market who need a quarterback, they want to make sure that they can get one of the top 4 guys. So the Bears are likely maybe going to trade this pick this week
That's what it
because a
sounded
team
like.
that wants to ensure that they get their guy is going to have to pay a king's ransom for it and get up to number one. CJ Stroud, from everything I heard, had a really impressive week. He was really solid throwing the football. Obviously, Anthony Richardson wowed in the workouts. Will Levis is still getting the talk. People are going to love him. People are going to hate him. Same with Bryce Young. It was kind of funny watching him wear those sneakers that made him look taller, but then he did weigh in at, 200 plus pounds, and he decided not to work out, but he's probably the consensus, for the most part, the consensus number one quarterback on most analyst board. He certainly has the best tape of the four quarterbacks, but if four guys can go in the top 10, that would be a blessing. And then on top of that, there's a wild card thrown into the mix here.
Yeah.
And Daniel Jeremiah made this comment. Hendon Hooker could be ready week 1. And, he could be ready for so maybe he's not going to start the year at quarterback, but he's a guy who could come in, you could put him on the PUP list. You can start working him in. And then maybe by the end of the year, if you're a team in need of a quarterback, Hendon Hooker could be your guy. Minnesota is in there in the 20s, right? The New York Giants, who knows what's going on with Daniel Jones and whether they can get Daniel Jones under contract. The New York Giants are sitting there in the 20s. Maybe a team wants to trade up into the 20s. I don't know. What percentage do you think we could see 5 quarterbacks off the board before the Buffalo Bills pick at 28? I'd put it about 40%.
Yeah, I think it's less than 50, but here's the thing, right? Where it comes down to was it the Josh Allen draft the last time we had 5 picked in the first round? I think it might have been. And you saw Lamar getting picked at the very tail end of that first round in 2018. And look, there was a lot of differing viewpoints on a guy like Lamar Jackson that year. There's going to be a lot of differing viewpoints on a guy like Hendon, right? Hendon Hooker. So is a team going to be willing to come up and take him? If a team that is picking early passes on a quarterback and they feel like they miss out for some reason, will they kind of trade back up using one of their early second round picks to move back into the tail end of the first to take a quarterback? There's going to be, what's interesting about this year's draft is in the late first round, there are still teams that could use a quarterback. You mentioned the Vikings, you mentioned the Giants, and usually teams picking towards the end of the first round are playoff teams that have established quarterbacks, and they're not really looking to take quarterbacks. What that makes this year's draft really interesting, because you have a couple teams out there, depending what happens with Daniel Jones. Obviously, we saw the Seahawks lock up Geno Smith today, but it's going to be very interesting to see if those teams, if they don't lock up their quarterbacks in free agency, then end up competing or vying for draft position with teams that may be looking to trade back up in if they do. Now, it's not likely, because if you're in a case where that 5th quarterback's available, those early teams probably did take the quarterback. So going to be very interesting. It would be great if it happened before the Bills pick. Obviously, that could drop one more guy to them, but I'd put it maybe at right now, I'll say 25%, a little bit lower than what you're saying.
Did any of the sort of mid to late round quarterbacks stand out to you? I mean, Tanner McKee looked good, despite the fact that they asked him to do little to nothing at Stanford. He's going to go in the 3rd round. So he's maybe too rich for the Bills' blood. But if the Buffalo Bills were looking to use a 5th or a 6th round pick on a quarterback, did anyone in Indy even remotely stick out to you? Because most of these quarterbacks this year, outside of the top 4 or 5 guys, they really do not do it for me.
No, I mean, obviously you look at a guy like Tyson Bagent, and he had good testing numbers. He's got size, he's that 6'3", 215, 210 type of guy. 2021 Harlan Hill Trophy winner, which is the MVP of Division II football. So I mean, look, he's got that kind of underdog, sort of long shot type of profile that maybe Josh Allen had, and you maybe say look, maybe we give another guy like that a chance because he tested well athletically, but and he did play football and basketball in high school. Maybe him.
And the thing about him though is he's just he's so much of a project. That is a guy where I almost feel like the Buffalo Bills would sign a veteran backup, keep Matt Barkley, and keep a Tyson Bagent, keep 2 quarterbacks on the practice squad, because that's how raw a guy like Bagent is. I don't know what he would give you in the quarterback room in terms of like supporting or even like helping,
That's
with
true.
Josh
That's a good
Allen.
point.
My favorite quarterback of the bunch is and a lot of people like Tyson Bagent. I just wasn't a fan. I was ribbing some people on social media, so they might give me a hard time in the comment section. I know Randy was one of them, but my guy is Jake Haener. He kind of reminds me of Baker Mayfield, and people are like, well, why would you want Baker Mayfield? I'm like, well, if you can get Baker Mayfield in the 4th or the 5th round, you would take a Baker Mayfield, like a solid quarterback. Jake Haener kind of gives me those vibes, a quarterback like that, or a quarterback like a Case Keenum. Aiden O'Connell, I've always called like the JV Jared Goff. Those guys are probably going to go sooner than I would like. So really the two guys that stuck out to me, Jaron Hall, who had an awful Senior Bowl week, so I'd almost practically take him off of my board. And then I'm going to go back to my guy, DTR. I thought he tested pretty well. Dorian Thompson-Robinson, 5 years of a starter at UCLA. Probably just going to mention him every podcast up until the draft, just sort of manifest that one.
You've been talking about him for a while.
Into reality. I've been talking about for 2 years. I talked about him last year on the pre-draft Rose before he decided to go back to UCLA for his super senior year. But a couple of people in the comment section have mentioned Stetson Bennett, and they're doing it to troll me because I think people at this point know my disdain for Stetson Bennett. So I'm going to throw out my early, and I think we got the graphic here for it. I'm going to throw out my early. No, we don't have a Jabroni of the week graphic. That's all right though. I'm going to throw out my early Jabroni of the week here, and that's to Daniel Jeremiah of the NFL Network, because I mean, maybe he's not a jabroni, maybe kudos to him, but he was clearly collecting Stetson Bennett's agent's check this weekend. When Stetson Bennett was on the field working out, those NFL Network guys could not stop riding his jock. This is a guy in Stetson Bennett. I get it. He won at Georgia surrounded by a bunch of behemoth all-stars, sub 6 foot, sub 200 pounds. He passed up the Senior Bowl because he thought he was too good for it. That week when he passed up the Senior Bowl, he was arrested for public intoxication. I will be so happy if somebody uses a day 2, early day 3 pick on Stetson Bennett, and it drops somebody like a real football player to us in like the 3rd or the 4th round. I would be so happy.
You're going to be so mad when the Bills
Stetson Bennett would be. If they draft Stetson Bennett, I will lose my mind.
You're going to be so mad when the Bills you're going to be so mad the Bills go Jake Fromm part 2 and draft Stetson Bennett in like the 5th round.
I do not
Chris
I
just
do
made
not
that comment too.
Understand the hype. All right, let's move on now to the running back position. I thought the running back position was interesting. I don't think anyone did anything to really hurt themselves. I think Bijan obviously was the talk of the town. He tested pretty well. Zach Charbonnet, he tested pretty well. And of course you had Roschon Johnson, who tested pretty well, as pretty explosive guy as well, the Texas backup to Bijan Robinson. What are your thoughts? What are the stock up for you for running backs in this year's combine?
Yeah, I mean, look, I didn't necessarily think that there was like a ton of surprises. I would say, right? Like a guy like Keaton Mitchell tested well, obviously ran the 4.37 out of ECU. My brother-in-law talks about him all the time. He's an ECU alum. He's like, watch out for Keaton Mitchell at the combine. He's a really good player. And look, I mean, he's not even on a lot of people's, draft boards at this stage, right? You look at, prospect rankings boards, and he's not on a lot of them. So obviously coming in with a 3rd fastest 40 time, maybe he gets a few looks more as a draftable prospect than he might have gotten otherwise. Obviously he ran well. He did well in the broad jump as well. And was top 3 in the vertical. So athletically, that's a guy who kind of maybe improved his draft stock, but maybe only so much for, going from like a priority UDFA to a guy that becomes draftable. But I did feel like for the running back group overall, not a lot of jockeying, I would say, as far as like guys necessarily moving ahead or moving down behind other guys. I still think that Bijan is the class and the cream of the crop of this group. I don't think this is like years past where you had that kind of debate of, Najee versus Etienne versus Javonte, or even last year, like Breece Hall versus Kenneth Walker. Like, to me, Bijan just did enough to keep himself very firmly entrenched as the clear consensus number 1. And to me, there wasn't a whole lot of, surprises, I guess, from this group as a whole.
Yeah,
me.
and a lot of running backs chose not to test, and I don't blame them. Like, their stock could be significantly dinged in Indy, but I think a lot of sort of the running backs sort of established themselves as day one and day two guys. Like, I think Bijan has established himself as a day one guy. He's
Yep.
going to go somewhere in the first round. I think Jameer Gibbs running that 4.36, he could sneak in to the first round.
Yep.
I think those Alvin Kamara comps are not unwarranted with a guy like Jameer Gibbs. Teams are going to ask themselves whether they want to invest that kind of capital. But either way, he's going very early on day two. I think Devon Achane from Texas A&M, despite the fact that he's sort of the Chan Gailey water bug type, I think he really helped himself with testing this week. I think he solidified himself as a day two guy. You have Zach Charbonnet, who tested very well. I think he's a day two guy. I was really hoping some other guys would run and do some things. I was hoping Tajay Spears would do more workouts, because I thought coming off of a really strong Senior Bowl, Tajay Spears could test really well. He could really just push himself up into that second round. And the reason why I'm wishing for that is because I'm wishing for other positions to fall to the Buffalo Bills. The more running board backs that come off the board, the happier I am. Trust me, like, I like 20 of these running backs in this class. I like them.
This happens to us
do.
every year.
Yeah.
We love so many of these guys, and then just not practical.
But I'm to the point where, like, I'm not even thinking about a running back this year, really, until we hit the fourth round of the draft. Like, the second the clock ends of the third round of the draft is when I'll start thinking about running backs. Like, in terms of running backs, I want the Buffalo Bills to draft. Who's left? Who's there? Who can we get in the fourth round? Or if there's just such a large number of guys left, who could slide to the sixth? Who could slide to the seventh? Because like there are a legitimate like 20 dudes that I like in this draft class, 25 dudes I like in this draft class. Some of them will be there in the late rounds. And I think most people in the comment section will agree that the Buffalo Bills really should not be addressing running back in the first three rounds, despite the fact that there are certainly a caliber of running backs, the likes we have not seen in a couple of years.
Yeah, and it's a big question we'll see to maybe provide clarity on this position is what happens with Devin Singletary in free agency, right? And if they do anything to kind of restructure Nyheim Hines. Obviously, they went ahead and drafted James Cook in the second round last year. They traded for Nyheim Hines. I would imagine that he'll either be back on his current salary or the Bills will rework him to try to keep him in the fold. Otherwise, it's kind of a waste of a trade. Devin Singletary, more than likely, probably out the door. And then you kind of ask yourself the question, with only 6 draft picks, do you use a draft pick on a running back, or do you see what kind of bargain bin type of running back you might be able to sign in free agency? Like we've mentioned, Latavius Murray as an option, among other guys. So only 6 draft picks. And if you're not likely to take a guy in the top 3 rounds, are you willing to spend one of your only 6 draft picks on a running back? That is going to be very interesting. But free agency should clear up, I think, how much of a priority that will be for the Bills.
And I will say this too. One running back who I need to go and I need to look more up on is Deneric Prince from Tulsa. He was a talk of a lot of guys in Indianapolis this week. He had a really good sort of workout. He obviously didn't run the 40 or anything of that nature, but at 6 foot, 216 pounds, he is a guy who had a pretty decent score. His athleticism score on NFL.com is on the tracker was A9. Excuse me. He did run the 40-yard dash.
5th best broad jump as well.
Yeah. 5th best broad jump. So a guy like Deneric Prince is a guy that I need to go in and I need some work on, because I said, like, there's 25 running backs in this class that I like. Deneric Prince wasn't one of them. Evan Hall, I think, is a guy too that might have worked himself into day 2 with his 4.47, getting a sub 4.5. I think Evan Hall is a guy who really had a big week at the Senior Bowl, and I think he followed it up with a really decent week in Indy. So a guy like Evan Hall, you're like, well, he's going to be a 4th, 5th round pick. He might have combined his Senior Bowl with his combine and moved himself up to the 3rd or 4th round, regardless of the tape and what he put out in Northwestern. So that's sort of what the combine is all about. All right, let's transition now to wide receivers. And before we get into sort of like stock up, stock down, and before getting into any of that, we got a super chat here. So let's get to it real quick. Just the Tip of Canoe comes in the super chat. Always appreciate super chats. And thank you, Just the Tip of Canoe, for your super chat. He says, I have that feeling Blake Corum from Michigan is going to be a fun NFL running back. He is so low to the ground, but hides behind that great that O-line. Great show. Yeah. And guess what? Blake Corum will be a great option for the Buffalo Bills in 2024 because he's going back to Michigan. So just Tippecanoe, if you are a Michigan fan, Blake Corum is coming back, bringing it on back for another year. So he will be someone that we're definitely going to be talking a lot about in 2024 because that'll be James Cook entering the third year of his 4-year deal, and maybe the Buffalo Bills needing to use a second or third round pick on a running back to refresh that position, depending on what they do this offseason. But on to wide receivers now. Before we get into sort of all the different wide receivers, like stock up, stock down, I want to just start by saying that I was super impressed with the combine of one wide receiver in particular, and that was Jackson Smith-Njigba. And I think to me, he worked his way into being my number one wide receiver because of his combine. It was close. He was back and forth between Zay Flowers and Jordan Addison. I'm sitting here trying to differentiate and figure who's going to be my number one wide receiver in this class. It's a weird class. There's sort of no prototypical like X outside receiver outside of Quentin Johnston, who's got plenty of question marks surrounding him as well. No 40 for Jackson Smith-Njigba, but it'll be interesting to see what 40 he runs at Ohio State's Pro Day. But he still convinced me with his testing that he can be an alpha slot receiver in the National Football League, a pseudo number one like a Cooper Kupp or like an Amon-Ra St. Brown, even though he doesn't play a typical number one position on the football field. Measured in at 6 foot 196. He had a 6.57 3 cone, which is the 12th best since 2007, a 3.93 short shuttle, 4th best since 2007. This guy's just got absolutely elite change of direction ability. I think it's almost a given that he's gone by the time the Buffalo Bills pick. But if the Buffalo Bills could move up 5-6 spots and they could secure a Jackson Smith-Njigba, I think this guy could be just an insane addition to this Buffalo Bills offense.
Yeah, 939 RAS even without the 40. As you mentioned, those numbers, as far as the past several years, he was the top shuttle and top 3 cone out of anyone who tested at the combine of the receivers. We've seen his route running on display throughout his career. He's a separator. This is the type of guy the Bills could really use, right? And like we've had this debate, not necessarily debate, but there's been a lot of good chatter in the Cover One group chat about like, what does Josh Allen really need and what does he prefer from his weapons? And like there's been a lot of talk of like, well, should they add another tight end because they need bigger body? But like, does he really need bigger body guys, or does he need guys who can separate? And I think to me, I'm with you. I'm ready to put Jackson as my I think right now is my number one wide receiver in this class. And I agree with you that it's a little bit tough. Like I definitely think I'm willing to listen to arguments for other guys. Jordan Addison didn't have the best testing. So like maybe that, drops him down. Like to me, it's almost like when you do like, like all-star voting or something, like there's a guy that gets like the top like percentage of the votes, but there's always going to be a few other guys who kind of get votes for that number one spot. And I think that's kind of how it is this year. I don't necessarily know that it's a super consensus as far as who the top guy is, but he's got to be, right up there in consideration.
Yeah. And like I said, like looking at guys whose like stocks are up, Zay Flowers is up through the roof. I think Zay Flowers could have worked himself.
He's my number two. He's my number two right now.
Into like a top 15. Jordan Addison might have tested himself to the Buffalo Bills at pick number 27, and that would be great. And then you have Quentin Johnston too. I'm not so high on Quentin Johnston. Like I get it. Like he's just an absolute freak of a physical specimen. I think there's a lot on tape that leaves to be desired with a Quentin Johnston. If Quentin Johnston was on the board, I would advocate taking a risk with a guy with that kind of athletic ability, but he's not my preferred choice. I would like to go get that like alpha slot type of receiver, and Addison, Flowers, and Njigba more fit that mold. But another point I sort of wanted to make here too, because it seemed like all of the upper tier wide receivers check boxes. Like I have a list of stock down, and there's like 2 guys on my list of stock down. Like it wasn't really a laundry list of guys who I think really dinged their stock in Indianapolis this week. It seems like all of the upper tier wide receivers sort of checked the boxes that they needed to check. And I made this comment on social media. Like people were shocked when Khalil Shakir went in the 5th round last year. This year, people are going to feel that way about like a half a dozen guys. There's literally 25 guys who I have seen a good chunk of people I trust have like round 1 to 4 grades on, and they all can't go that high, right? Like
Mhm.
there are 30 wide receivers like in this draft class where I'm like, it wouldn't shock me if a team used a day 1 or a day 2 pick on any of these guys because they all are, in my opinion, graded so closely together this year. So
Mhm.
there's going to be guys sitting there in round 4. There's going to be guys sitting there in round 5 that could be plug and play wide receivers in the National Football League. I'm quickly just going to read through the names of like my top 30 wide receivers because once we start getting towards the end of this list, like these guys are going to be around the 4th, the 5th. You might be able to snag one of these guys in the 6th round, and that's going to be absolutely crazy. So, first round grades that I have right now are Jackson Smith and Jigba, Zay Flowers, Jordan Addison, and Quentin Johnston. Second round grades I have right now, Josh Downs, Dalen Hylett, Jaden Reed, Tyler Scott. Third round grades I have right now, Nathaniel Dell, Xavier Hutchinson, Trey Palmer, Marvin Mims Jr., and Keyshawn Butte. Fourth round, Cedric Tillman, Parker Washington, Jalen Cropper, Raheem Jarrett, Jonathan Mingo. Fifth round, Michael Wilson, Rashee Rice, Trey Tucker, Puka Nakua, Andre Yashovis. Now I'm getting into like my 6th round in terms of like averages, how many wide receivers are drafted on average each year. Now I'm getting into my 6th round, and there's names like A.T. Perry, Charlie Jones, Antoine Green, Bryce Ford Wheaton,
Where'd you have Xavier Hutchinson?
Dontavion
Did you
Witt.
mention? Did you say him? I was
I
kind of
had,
zoned out.
yeah, I had him in the 3rd round.
Okay,
So
yeah,
like
right.
literally, and my list is different than other people's lists, obviously, right? Like someone says, Cedric Tillman's not going to make it out of the 3rd round. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he doesn't, right? But that's sort of the point I'm getting at. Like I have a guy like in Jonathan Mingo and Cedric Tillman in the 4th round.
Yeah,
And a lot
I
of these
agree.
people
They're
are
day
like,
3.
and a lot of these guys are like, well, no, they could go in they could go in the 3rd. Like
Yeah, they
some
very
of
well
these
could.
guys could go in the 2nd. It wouldn't surprise me if a team pulled the trigger on like a Trey Palmer in the 2nd round, or even a guy like Cedric Tillman in the 2nd round. So that's what I'm talking about with this draft class. Like I just named 30 dudes. It wouldn't blow my mind if A.T. Perry or Charlie Jones were drafted in the 3rd or the 4th round. And I have 6th round on them, right? Like that is where this draft class is. Someone mentioned, did you mention Trey Scott? Yeah, 2nd round grade. Like, so guys like Jalen Hylett, guys like Tyler Scott, you can go get that speed that you're looking for from in the 2nd round. And then El Sher comes in and says Dante Demas Jr. from Maryland, underrated, 6'4" with speed. I don't disagree. He's now 2 years removed from an ACL. So I think the biggest thing for him is his medicals at the combine, which we're not going to really be privy to. And he's a guy who could go in the 5th, 6th round of this draft. And we're like, where did Dante Demas Jr. come from? Because
Mhm.
tore his ACL 2 years ago, even though he was on a tear, had sort of like a meh year here at Maryland. Now he's 2 years removed from that ACL. Teams looked at the tape before the ACL tear, and now they were interested in a guy like Dante Demas because his medicals checked out. So like, there's just so many wide receivers. Who are some guys like their stock is just trending up for you?
Well, like one guy that I thought, needed
Mhm.
to kind of put together a decent combine because didn't really make his mark in the Senior Bowl after a lot of hype going into the Senior Bowl week of practice was Rashee Rice. I know you had him as a day 3 guy on
Mhm.
your list, but I thought, from a testing standpoint, he wasn't the fastest guy. I think he ran like a 4.51 40, but he really tested well in mostly all of the other
Mhm.
measurables and ended up coming out of there with a 9.65 RAS. So for a guy who didn't contribute in the box score or in the actual Senior Bowl game, and there were
Mhm.
some, maybe up and down practices for him throughout the week, I thought that solidified him to me as probably, um, a guy that could, another one of those guys that could maybe sneak his way into day 2
Yep.
because he had a, solid enough combine. So he was a guy I thought needed to have a good combine, and he did. Just knowing that there was so much hype around him going into going into that Senior
Mhm.
Bowl week. So that's one guy I thought, obviously the talk of the town was Jonathan Mingo with all the
Mhm.
crazy testing numbers he put up.
Dime store AJ Brown, baby. That's Jonathan Mingo.
I mean, uh, Iosivas from,
Mhm.
from the Ivy League.
Yeah,
Obviously, he
Princeton. Yep.
had 4.43 40 time. Great combine, 9.92 RAS, third best among all wide receivers. He's an FCS first team All American last year, first team All Ivy in 2022, sixth in receiving yards and all time in Princeton history. So, like, he's a guy who probably earned himself, maybe a round or two better than what maybe he had originally, been slated for. He's a guy that, TDN as of early February had him as like their 115th overall prospect, which puts him kind of right in that fourth round range. But another guy who could maybe sneak into day two because of good testing numbers. But like you said, guys are going to fall. It's going to come down to preference from teams. What do they need? What fits what they're trying to do on offense? Situation matters. The situation for a guy, even though he may be higher rated on someone's board, maybe not on another team's board because of what they need. There are going to be guys available on day 3 in this draft that are talented. And we saw that with guys like Shakir last year.
Yeah. I mean, Chris Jenke mentioned like there are some good slot receivers in this draft that are available in the middle rounds. Raheem Jarrett from Maryland, someone that Stephon Diggs has mentored in his youth. That is someone who's going to be available in about the 4th round, who could be a slot option for the Buffalo Bills. He tested pretty well, and you saw him clock a pretty decent 40 time with his, pulling it up here, 4.44. Then you have a guy I've been watching for 2 years now who I really like as a slot option, and that's Jalen Moreno Cropper out of Fresno State. I didn't think he had a 4.440 in him. He goes and runs a 4.440. Jalen Moreno Cropper goes from a 5th round pick, in my opinion, to a guy who could go in day 2. Like a guy who can go late 3. If not, I think Jalen Moreno Cropper now, it went from like a 5th round pick to a 4th round pick with the combine he had. I'm a big fan of him. I've always been a big fan of Jonathan Mingo. I call him dime store AJ Brown. I'm not calling him AJ Brown. I'm not saying he's going to be an AJ Brown impact type of player.
That's like a backhanded compliment.
Yeah, right. Like he looks like AJ Brown. He sort of plays that style of game. He's this big, juiced out type of physical slot receiver who can make some plays after the catch. And then you also have Trey Tucker from Cincinnati, who's another sort of undersized slot who I think tested very well and ran very well. You mentioned Andre Yeshivas from Princeton. I like the fact that he tested really well because I'd rather somebody else go get that gadget guy to drop a different guy to us, kind of like one of the 4 guys I just mentioned. And then the two go back and look at the tape guys for me. I really liked Bryce Ford Wheaton. I went back and I searched him up on my Twitter and I was tweeting about him in September. He's a guy who transferred into West Virginia. They also had JT Daniels at the start of the year there. I mean, you saw the testing numbers for Bryce Ford Wheaton, like almost a 10 RAS, just like the 40 that he ran. What was the 40 time for Bryce Ford Wheaton? It was 4.38, 6'4", 230 pounds. Like the guy is an absolute specimen. And you go back and you sort of look at sort of his tape. His tape is good, but he kind of got buried at West Virginia because West Virginia didn't really have a quarterback and they weren't just very good this year. So a guy like Bryce Ford Wheaton, again, people go back and look at the tape and they're like, hold on a second. Like box score numbers might not have been here. All indications coming into the combine was this guy is a 6th, 7th round developmental X receiver. Maybe this guy can play sooner than we think, or maybe this guy does have more potential than we think. Now all of a sudden you're going to see Bryce Ford Wheaton go in the 3rd or the 4th round, possibly in this draft because of this combine. And then again, would drop another guy to us. Another guy who tested really well was Matt Landers at 6'4", 215 pounds. The guy ran a 4.37. This is a guy who started his career at Georgia, transferred to Toledo. I'm sorry, he was 6'4", 200 pounds, not 215 pounds. Started his career at Georgia, transferred to Toledo, then transferred to Arkansas, back into the SEC, had a couple of solid seasons at Toledo and Arkansas. And at 6'4", 200 pounds, he ran his 40-yard dash in 4.37 seconds. So if the Buffalo Bills are looking to double dip at receiver, right? Like they get Jackson Smith and Jigba in the 1st round, or they go out and they get Jordan Addison in the 1st round, or they get Josh Downs in the 2nd round. You're looking to double dip. A guy like Matt Landers at 6'4", 200 pounds, running that 4.37 40. That's the kind of guy you want to go get in the back half of the draft to develop behind Gabriel Davis. Gabriel Davis leaves in free agency next year. Now all of a sudden you have this guy who's been in your system for a year, 6'4", 200 pounds, got that 4.37 boundary speed. and he's had a year in your system as well, working with new receivers coach Adam Henry. So a guy like Matt Landers is now on my radar as well. He's a guy I've always liked because he was a MAC guy, but I really just kind of forgot about him until the combine day, and he goes and he pops off that 40-yard dash because there were a number of wide receivers in this draft class, um, you know, who are similar size to Matt Landers. You had your Grant Duboses, you had your Justin Shorters, you had your Dante Demases, you had your Jason Brownlees, your Michael Jeffersons, your Jadon Hazelwoods. You had a lot of these guys who like 6'4" ish, 200 pounds ish. Matt Landers is the one who sticks out because he went and goes and he runs the 4.37. None of those other guys could really do that.
Yeah, none of those guys could do that. Another guy that I thought had a decent combine was A.T. Perry. We mentioned him on our kind of early preview show, but again, not a guy that's necessarily going to separate, but good ball skills, can get down the field. A guy I've liked from the beginning, Xavier Hutchinson. There's a little bit of subjectivity to how people have interpreted his combine. Didn't have a great RAS score, but not that was totally expected. Ran a 4.5-ish 40, if I recall, 4.51 maybe. But he's not a speed guy, so he did pretty well in the 3-cone. A guy that maybe, dare I say, stock down from the combine and could slip into day 3 as well. But I'm still pretty high on him overall as a prospect.
Yeah, Just the Tippet Canoe coming in with a super chat. He says Charlie Jones in the late rounds would be awesome. I watched Purdue football. The dude's always open. Also, he won the top returner award. Boiler up. Yeah. Charlie Jones is the guy who I've been watching for 5 years now because, he got his career started off at the University of Buffalo. Then he transferred from the University of Buffalo to Iowa. And then, as Iowa receivers typically do, in order for someone to realize they exist, transfer to another school. And he transferred to Purdue. And with his high school quarterback, Aiden O'Connell, he put up some really good numbers. And a guy like Charlie Jones is weird, right? So I got a 6-round grade on Charlie Jones. I think when all is said and done, he's going to be one of the receivers that slips because of just the depth of the receivers in this class. But he's also, all it takes is one team to fall in love. Charlie Jones could be a 4th-round pick. Like, that's what I'm talking about, like how close these guys are in terms of the way they're graded and the way they could possibly go in this draft class. And Charlie Jones also provides you with that return ability as well. Inside, outside flex, return ability. I don't know if Charlie Jones is ever going to be like a guy who starts in the National Football League, but he certainly could be like a really, really good wide receiver 4 that you really appreciate having, having on your team. So Charlie Jones is definitely somebody to keep an eye on as well. Any other stock ups for you before maybe moving to some stock downs?
Stock up.
Because I got Jaden Reed. I like Jaden Reed. I think that, Chris Trapasso has come on, he went on WGR 50 and, he wrote an article about it, comparing him athletically to a Stephon Diggs. And then you see him come out, Jaden Reed, at a similar size to Stephon Diggs, similar athletic profile to Stephon Diggs, run a 4.45. Our guy Bruce Exclusive made this comment on social media, and he was on Joe DeRosa's show on Saturday. Like, he thinks it's criminal that Josh Downs is seen as this bona fide 2nd-round fringe 1st-round receiver, and a guy like Jaden Reed is seen as like maybe a 3rd-rounder. I made the comment on social media. I'd be completely comfortable with Jaden Reed at 59. I think Jaden Reed worked his way into being a 2nd-round receiver between his Senior Bowl and his combine.
Yep,
a guy who doesn't get past the ball a lot because he's at Michigan State. He's a guy who I think worked his way into the 2nd round.
Did make a nice play in the Senior Bowl, showed off that kind of separation speed underneath on that play he had kind of across the field and then up the sideline. Good week of practice there. Not a whole lot of consensus on him as far as where he's going to go. You see people say 2nd round. You see people even say mid-day 3. And this is another one of those guys where you start listing out all these receivers you've listed off. You get to 25, 30 guys in no time. Someone's going to fall out. And it is kind of weird to me that the guys like Josh Downs and Jaden Reed are viewed so differently by some. I'm maybe not as high on Josh Downs as a lot of people are. I'm very close to the ACC here. Obviously watch UNC every year, play against my Wolfpack. I like him. He's good.
Yeah.
But I've also grown wary of these UNC receivers coming out over the past several years that we've talked up in the pre-draft process, guys like Daz Newsome and others that, blanking on the guy's name from Washington now. that was
De'Ami
UNC,
Brown.
De'Ami Brown, like
Mm.
flashes, but like hasn't necessarily
Mm.
translated in recent years. And I'm not saying like these guys are all the same, but I would be a little bit hesitant with Josh Downs, and I'd almost be willing to maybe take a flyer on Jaden Reed over a guy like Josh Downs, me personally. So,
Yeah. Moving now to like stock down, like I would say to me personally, Jalen Hyatt stock down. I don't want to put too much stock into a 40, but when a guy is bragging he's going to run a 4.29 and he runs a 4.41 and he's sort of known as a speed slot receiver, and there's question marks about whether he can survive on the boundary because he hasn't really faced a lot of press coverage. When you go and run a 4.41, even though a 4.41 is very, very good, you're kind of disappointed just because the guy talked himself up so much. And I look at Jalen Hyatt and I look at, as much as I would love to add a skill set like Jalen Hyatt, Dan Kiki comes in here and says, Trey Palmer, because we deserve a fast guy for once. Trey Palmer, similar size, even a little bit bigger, similar speed, and he does a lot of his speed work from the slot. So Trey Palmer is a guy that you can sort of develop as an inside-outside, stretching the field type of player. You have Tyler Scott from Cincinnati, who also tested very well and proved to be a pretty fast guy. So I'm sort of down on Jalen Hyatt because I feel like you can get a similar skill set a round later in Tyler Scott, or maybe even a round or 2 rounds later in a Trey Palmer, who knows where Trey Palmer is going to go. So, I mean, he can go anywhere between the 2nd and the 4th round. That'll be interesting. Same with really Tyler Scott. So either of these guys could be a round or 2 rounds later. So that's why I'm down on Jalen Hyatt. But at the same time, while I'm disappointed in Jalen Hyatt because I was expecting that 4.29, everyone was talking about him. Like he was the talk of the town. It seemed like a lot of scouts, a lot of GMs wanted to talk to reporters about Jalen Hyatt. So I think there is something to be said about that.
There is something to be said about that. And again, as we said at the onset of the show, this is one piece of the equation, right? I mean, you go back and look at the tape of Jalen Hyatt, and he shows up in games. He shows up in big moments of games. He had Tennessee there right at the top, right near the top of the rankings all year for a team that really has gone through some struggles, right, in recent years until just the very recent past. So I feel like a guy like Jalen Hyatt will have a chip on his shoulder as well coming into the NFL. And I think, like we've said, these measurements, these RAS scores, it's one piece of the equation. You go and marry that with the film, and you can kind of see why people are falling in love with Jalen Hyatt.
Yeah, looking at some more stock down, like we've already talked a couple of times about Jordan Addison. By stock down, I mean maybe you would have liked to see more explosion in the testing numbers for a guy who measures in at 5'11", 173. I thought Keyshawn Boutte, a guy who's supposed to be like a speed athletic slot, who's not the most refined receiver, didn't exactly blow up the testing numbers. So a guy like him, he's going to slide. And then Michael Wilson, I was a little shocked by his 40 time. And let me pull it up here.
Slow. It's like 4.5 something, right? But
yeah,
he still tested like 9.8 RAS,
yeah,
right? So like everything else, he had the most bench reps of any receiver.
Yeah. So
I still like him. I still like him a lot.
I love Michael Wilson as a 4th, 5th round double dip guy you develop behind Gabriel Davis. Kind of falls into that category I was talking about with like guys like Matt Landers or Charlie Jones, but fingers crossed, right? Like,
Maybe.
Slow 40 can't make it up at his Stanford Pro Day. Maybe you can get him in the 5th round instead of the 4th round. Like those are the kind of things that you sort of like cross your fingers and you hope for come out of the combine. Like as Brandon Bean said when Gabriel Davis was running his 40, I hope he doesn't run a fast one because I like what I see on tape and I don't need to see him run a fast 40. All right, on to tight ends now. And obviously the talk of this position group was Darnell Washington. He was moving sleds with ease. He was making one-handed sideline body contorted catches. This statistic right here, Darnell Washington and Cooper Kupp had the same 20-yard shuttle time, 4.08. Darnell Washington weighs 60 pounds more than Cooper Kupp. I'm not comparing the players because they're obviously different players. And Darnell Washington was also sitting behind Brock Bowers. So there are some differences here. But I'm comparing the narratives around the players at the combine. Darnell Washington and O.J. Howard seem very, very similar to me in terms of the narrative. Prestige programs, size freaks with blocking chops who people felt were sort of underutilized as receivers in college football. Talk about a little bit about that sort of narrative surrounding Darnell Washington, and do you think this guy is bona fide, made himself a first round draft pick?
On the second question, I think the answer is yes, he's made himself a first round draft pick. I wouldn't pick him in the first round, but I
Same.
can understand why people are going to fall in love with the measurables. I mean, you can't teach the height, you can't teach that athleticism necessarily, but tight end is a tricky position, man. And when you invest a first round pick in tight end, you have to be patient. You have to be understanding that maybe a guy that might not contribute right away his rookie year. You look at a guy like TJ Hawkinson, who was drafted in the top 10, now on a different team. He was at Oliver's draft class, now on a different team, was traded to the Vikings. Guys drafted high at tight end, it doesn't always translate immediately. And to me, I generally don't think this is a great tight end class. That's my personal opinion. I don't think it's a great class. I don't think it's a really deep class. There's a couple guys I like, as middle later guys, but I think Darnell Washington's going to benefit from this being a fairly weak tight end class, in my opinion, and he's going to have someone maybe reach and take him in the first round. I wouldn't personally, but I can see a team doing it.
And that's interesting too. Like I disagree with you. I think this is a solid tight end group, but I can see where you're coming from, because like Darnell Washington, like I can see him getting drafted in the NFL and just sort of like blending in. But my hopes is like he tested his way into the first round and maybe goes ahead of pick 27, because that could drop a guy to the Buffalo Bills. Even if not, like late or early second, that could drop a guy to the Buffalo Bills later on in the second round. A lot of people are down on Michael Mayer after the combine, and I'm like, why? Like, he's not going to test well. That's not who Michael Mayer is. Dalton Kincaid didn't test. So a lot of the talk around the tight end is going away. I've, made the comment on the show that I think Luke Musgrave is one of the more overrated players in this draft class, but the combination of Musgrave, Mayer, Kincaid, Darnell Washington, I'm really hoping that they continue to keep this hype train rolling, because like if Michael Mayer and Darnell Washington come off the board before 27, and then like Dalton Kincaid and Luke Musgrave go after the Buffalo Bills, that's going to drop a decent player to 27. That's going to drop a decent player to 59. And then there are still some tight ends in the middle of this draft. Somebody mentioned Sam Laporta. We're going to get to in a moment.
Laporta. Yeah.
These are guys who maybe the Buffalo Bills can consider pulling the trigger on, because Bean has mentioned tight end twice now this offseason. He mentioned it on the Eric Wood podcast. He mentioned it in his combine presser. Rob Boris was working out with tight ends on the football field in Indianapolis. Maybe the Buffalo Bills pulled some strings to get Rob Boris down there. They signed OJ Howard last year. They were in on Evan Ingram last year. They had a pre-draft visit with a ton of different tight ends last year. Maybe signs are pointing to the Buffalo Bills, this TE2 being a position that the Buffalo Bills might want to address. And maybe Ken Dorsey didn't run more 12 personnel last year, not because he's incapable of it, but because maybe they like Quentin Morris, but don't think he's that kind of tight end.
Yeah, and maybe I was a bit unfair in saying that it's not a deep class. I think it's probably more that I just don't see the top end studs that maybe we've seen in years past. I think there is a decent amount of mid-tier talent, but I don't really see it being like a star-studded at the top type of class. There are guys I like Laporta. He's the guy that stood out to me as a mid-round type talent, and I kind of agree with Eric Turner when it comes to tight end. Right? Is it a question of Ken Dorsey not using tight ends because he didn't have the personnel? Or is it a question of like he doesn't really know how to use multiple tight ends? Until I actually can see some like consistency in that, and the fact is that we didn't really get Dawson Knox going until like the latter stages of the season, second half of the season. I am not about investing day 1 or day 2 draft picks on tight end. I'm comfortable, going as early as round 4, day 3, like cool. I'm good with that. And that's why a guy like Laporta intrigues me, maybe as a 4th round guy, if he can make it that far, because that's the type of guy that I could really kind of get behind drafting in the middle rounds. I'm not going to advocate for the Bills drafting a tight end in day 1 or day 2, though. I just don't trust
Yeah.
Dorsey until I see it with this tight end position.
My only exception is I would take Dalton Kincaid at 28 in a heartbeat. I'll catch a lot of flack for that, so I'm going to keep it to myself for the most part. I would, in a heartbeat, take Dalton Kincaid at 27, just play him at slot receiver. That's how much I love Dalton Kincaid and his receiving ability over the middle of the football field.
Utah,
But
so
it might be a little scouting the helmet. I have a weird obsession with Utah football, but yeah, Sam Laporta could have tested himself into the second round. I think
like
Sam,
him. Yeah.
he's always been a guy. He's been on my radar for 2 years now. 9.25 RAS. I mean, just a great agility grade, a great explosion grade. Ran that 4.6 40-yard dash. Had a really good 20-yard split. Had a really good 10-yard split. And he's a guy who just sort of like gets lost in the shuffle because it's Iowa. But when you pull up the tape and you look at the fact, look at the plays where he does get the ball in his hands and then see his testing numbers, you see a guy that you can groom. And I think Sam Laporta, I think his like floor, like the latest he goes is like early round 3 now. So like, I think if people like had a dream of drafting Sam Laporta in the 4th round to pair with Dawson Knox, I just don't know if that's a reality. So now you might want to start looking at like the Luke Schoonmakers of the world. You might want to start looking at the Tucker Crafts of North Dakota of the world. Both of those guys tested well. You want to talk about a guy who tested off the charts, a guy who was on Bruce Feldman's freak list coming into the year, Zach Kuntz from Old Dominion at 6'7", 255 pounds, had a perfect 10 RAS, 4.55 40-yard dash. He kind of reminds me of Zach Davidson. Zach Davidson, much more raw, coming out of a Central Missouri. He's now on the Buffalo Bills practice squad. The way a lot of people are talking about Zach Kuntz, people were talking about Zach Davidson a couple of years ago. He was a late round pick to the Colts, wound up with the Vikings. Now he's on the Bills practice squad. Zach Kuntz is like that athletic profile of a Zach Davidson, who the Bills have shown a liking to because he's on the practice squad. But playing at Old Dominion, playing under the former USC coach, I'm blanking on his name now for some reason, but the former USC head coach, and playing with, I'm blanking on all the names right now, the former UB quarterback at Old Dominion. They put up some solid numbers this year. I'm sorry, that was Georgia Southern, so I apologize. But Zach Kuntz at Old Dominion, I just got my teams mixed up, had a really, relatively decent college career. So Zach Kuntz isn't some like D2 super raw guy. Like Zach Kuntz has some refinement to his game. And you saw the Rams, Rob Boris coming from the Rams, draft some tight ends in a similar mold to guys like Zach Kuntz over the years. So a guy like Zach Kuntz could be in play for the Buffalo Bills in the 3rd, 4th round as well.
Yeah, Zach Kuntz. There's a couple guys who didn't test at the combine that I kind of like late. I'll put it now just because he wasn't at the combine, but he's like my Daniel Bellinger this year. That's Leonard Taylor. He's my like tight end guy that I like late this year. I'm just gonna put it out there now because
he was at the combine. He just didn't test.
Yeah, I mean, didn't test. So it's like, what can you really glean from that? Nothing really. He was there, but obviously I think he was at the Shrine Bowl as well. But he is a guy that I've started kind of digging into a bit, and I kind of like his game, kind of like some of the things he's been saying in interviews as well about trying to aspire to be like Kelsey and things like that. Obviously you take that all with a grain of salt, but you like that the guy is, aspiring to be great, and he's got the size, 6'5", 250. So that would be a late round guy I wouldn't mind kind of taking a stab at.
Will Mallory tested pretty well. He's sort of a scrappy guy you can get in the later rounds. And then a guy who tested poorly, and I knew he was going to test poorly, but I still like him, is Payne Durham out of Purdue.
Yep.
He had a really good Senior Bowl. He had a really good college career at Purdue. So a guy like Payne Durham, like he's sitting there in the 5th, 6th round. I wouldn't mind the Buffalo Bills pulling the trigger on Payne Durham.
I mean, still 8.18 RAS. It wasn't bad.
It wasn't bad. It's just like compared to some of these other guys, it wasn't that great. So looking now at the offensive line, stock up, stock down. I'll tell you what, like there's a lot of chirping now that like maybe the Buffalo Bills aren't going to address offensive line early. Maybe the Buffalo Bills aren't going to take a guard early. Like the Buffalo Bills are going to be the type of team that are going to be content just trying to fill in patchwork in free agency, maybe draft a guy or two here. I think the team, like the people maybe who are expecting a double dip or a triple dip might be disappointed. I don't know. What are your thoughts on sort of that as we enter the offensive line chatter here? I think if the Buffalo Bills take a guy in the 1st round, it would be a right tackle.
Yeah, I think it would be a right tackle. And some of the tackles in this tested really, really well. I mean, Like, who do you even start with? Your guy Darnell Wright tested well.
He talked to every team but the Bills too, apparently. So Darnell Wright might not even be on the board when the Buffalo Bills pick at 27. That's how much of a riser he has been in this process.
Been all right, yeah, no kidding. And where's my stock up, stock down list here? I'm going to tell you who I stock up on. Nick Salvieri tested well. Stock up on him. Blake Freeland, obviously the talk of the combine, with that 9.82 RAS, close to the top, tested close to the top in almost every measurable. One of only 3 BYU guys to play and start all 13 games this year. 13 All AP, All American. Named Independent Offensive Lineman of the Year by College Football Network. So not a guy you're going to take in the first round, but he's definitely improved his stock. But man, I'm kind of with you now. Like, if you look at sort of what might be there for the Bills at 27, like I'm kind of with you that it could be tackle now over
because so many people.
Yep.
Because so many people are like mocking John Michael Schmitz to the Bills in the first round, and if they do it, I will be happy. I will be excited. I'll be jumping for joy. John Michael Schmitz is one of my favorite prospects in this year's draft. I think it could be an Eric Wood type of situation where he plays guard for a year, then he goes and he replaces Mitch Morse a year from now. I will love that pick, but it's not so much about loving the pick. It's about envisioning what the Buffalo Bills will do. Paris Johnson will be off the board. Broderick Jones will be off the board. But then you have Darnell Wright. You have, man, my brain is just freezing today. The kid from Ohio State, DeJuan Jones. You have Anton Harrison from Oklahoma. Those 3 guys, Jones, Harrison, and Wright, I think they're all legitimate options for the Buffalo Bills at pick number 27. And Charles G even comes in here and says, could Bergeron make a round 1 play? I don't know. I'd have to hear some more chatter. I think he certainly could, but unless I start hearing chatter, I just don't know. But then
I can't wait for
look at the New England Patriots. When did the New England Patriots pick? That's when Matthew Bergeron will go.
I can't wait for your everyone thinks he's going to be a 3rd rounder, 1st rounder call this year. I can't wait for you to make that pick.
Jim Wickens says Peter Skoronski. I did forget Skoronski. That's only because I really just do think he's like an elite guard. So I've always just considered him a guard, but to each their own. Like, Skoronski will definitely get to start at tackle, and he probably could play tackle in the National Football League. I just think that wouldn't be using him at his best position. But yeah, you mentioned Nick Selavetti from Old Dominion. Like, he's a guy too. He kind of reminds me of Ryan Bates a little bit. He's got some position versatility, tackle guard. You look at guys like Tyler Steen, tackle guard, Asim Richards, tackle guard. Like, those are some of the guys that I was keeping my eyes on. Brett Coleman said, he even said too on social media, like, I wasn't paying a lot of attention to Matthew Bergeron, but Matthew Bergeron looks super smooth. So again, like, Matthew Bergeron could be this year's Cole Strange as an offensive lineman that goes a lot quicker than people think. I don't know if he'll go in the first round, but I could definitely see him going like in the first 5 picks of the second round.
And
Jalen
Duncan tested well as well.
Jalen Duncan tested well. And that's the thing too. You mentioned, that's the only good thing I was reminded of. Jalen Duncan. And then you have Blake Freeland, Jalen Duncan, Blake Freeland. Those are like this year's Spencer Browns, right? Like, those are like this year's like guys who are athletic freaks, but guys who are raw and guys who need help. And I just don't know if you're the Buffalo Bills, if you're taking another raw, needs to take some time to develop right tackle. You have that in Spencer Brown for 2 more years of term. Like, if you're the Buffalo Bills and you're taking a right tackle, it's probably going to be Anton Harrison, DeJuan Jones, or Darnell Wright, because those are guys that you believe you can plug and play.
Yeah, and this is the thing. You re-sign Ike Bucker, like you mentioned. It's always easier to find a interior offensive lineman, a guard off the streets if you need be, right? You can go bring a Greg Van Roten back. You can go bring someone like that back onto your roster for like dirt cheap, right? And you can find a guy, a veteran in free agency that you can bring in, no problem. If you really feel you need to make a significant improvement on the offensive line with premium draft capital, and it's a need, right? It is definitely a need, then it makes most financial sense and most value sense to go for the right tackle, right? And it's tough because we still see that potential in Spencer Brown, and we look at him as that athletic guy, and you say, well, you'd hate to waste draft capital on a guy that's going to replace a currently developing younger player. If you're going to invest draft capital on a guy, you'd like to do it at a position where you just have like an older, like run-of-the-mill vet to kind of unseat with the rookie. But that just might not be what has to happen for this team right now. So it's really, really interesting to see. And Charles says, give me the best guard in the draft versus the fifth best tackle. And I could get behind that, right? I can get behind that argument as well. So don't, I'm not saying it has to be the tackle, but.
And Justin Phillips comes in here, says, did you guys mention Cody Mock? I have not mentioned Cody Mock yet. He's a guy we talked about at length during the Senior Bowl stuff too. And to me, the issue with him is strength, like anchor strength. Like that's going to be his biggest thing, transitioning from tight end to tackle, now to guard center. I don't know if a guy like Cody Mock is a start from day one type of guy. Like he's a guy who's going to probably start as a reserve. And we've already heard from a lot of people on social media, like, oh, we're just going to draft a guy just not to play them. Like if you're looking for a guy who's going to play right away, I just don't know if Cody Mauch is that guy. It's going to be a guy like John Michael Schmitz. It's going to be a guy like Matthew Bergeron, or it's going to be one of those three tackles we talked about. Chris Yankee comes in and says Cromer favorite David Edwards at guard, maybe. And this is what we sort of started the show with this, right? We re-signed Ike Bucker. We have Ryan Bates. We go out and we sign David Edwards to like a really modest $3-4 million a year type of deal. You now have Bates, you now have Bucker, you now have David Edwards, and then you have Mitch Morse at center. The Buffalo Bills could feel completely comfortable and content with that, and then wait until the third, fourth, fifth round to address guard. So as much as we want the John Michael Schmitzes or the Matthew Bergerons of the world, the Buffalo Bills might be like, not so fast. We're comfortable with these guys. We're going to wait to the middle rounds, and we're going to try to find some to develop. And there are a ton. Like a guy that really popped off at the combine was John Gaines out of UCLA. Like I've talked a bunch about Antonio Mafi from UCLA. Well, John Gaines, who has spent parts of the last 3 years starting at right guard and center in a Chip Kelly, like NFL pro style-ish offense there at UCLA. He had a 3-cone drill, which was first. A 20-yard shuttle was first. His vertical jump was third. His 10-yard split was third. His broad jump was third. And his 40-yard dash was sixth. Like John Gaines had an absolute awesome combine, and he tested well in a lot of drills that sort of project you towards NFL success.
He was the number one lineman tested score-wise for Raz. Yeah.
So John Gaines, you mentioned Nick Saladivetti from Old Dominion as a guy who tackle, move into guard. Tyler Steen in the middle rounds, tackle to guard. Asim Richards, tackle to guard. You even look at some of the other guards, Chandler Zavala, Antonio Mafi that I mentioned. Like there are guys, Nick Broker. There are a lot of guys you can get in the middle of this draft. So as much as we want the John Michael Schmitzes of the world, the Luke Whipplers of the world, that might not be a reality for the Buffalo Bills. And Ricky Stromberg impressed a lot of people too, the center from Arkansas.
Yep. Yeah, Ricky Stromberg tested well, and another center that tested well, Whipler from Ohio State, tested well.
Yep.
Okay, I would say he tested okay, but there was just a lot of really good test results from this offensive line group. I think it's a deep offensive line class. I don't know. It's hard for me to kind of compare to last year's class because we were so fixated on the Bills drafting interior offensive line. And this year it's kind of like we're now kind of straddling between tackle and guard. So it seems like there's a lot more names, but I think we also kind of wrote off tackle last year during the pre-draft process. So this year focusing on a lot more names because really, in reality, center, guard, and tackle could all be in play at some point in this draft for the Bills. And if you like, I do want to say, like, if you're the Bills and you like John Michael Schmitz, like, you're not getting Creed Humphrey. Like, let's just put that to rest. Like, you're like athletically, he's not close to Creed Humphrey, but if you feel like he can be your starting guard from day one and be your heir apparent to Mitch Morse, then I can see why people are getting behind that idea as well. For picking him, right? And Dylan says Cyrus Torrance season, and there's a lot of chatter on him. Up and down combine, you know.
I'm glad the Bills talked to him because you look at his weight at 338. Typically, Buffalo Bills are looking at those guys in the 300 and 305 to 315 pound range. So a guy who's pushing like 340, who's been noted to push 350, not exactly like an archetype fit. So it was good to see the Buffalo Bills were talking to Osiris Torrance. And then Chris Jenke coming in. A lot of guy getting Mitch Morse comps is the tall center from Wisconsin, Joe Tippmann. He had himself a pretty solid combine as well. He's another guy. Early in the second round, like first 5-10 picks of the second round, I wouldn't be surprised if Joe Tippmann comes off the board.
No, I wouldn't be surprised either. And like he's like this whole offensive line group is probably where, as we kind of head these next several weeks going into the draft, is probably where I'm going to spend the most of my time. And it's like offensive line, as Aaron Quinn has said, as a lot. It's a hard position to scout from watching film, knowing what to see, knowing what you're looking at. So I rely on a lot of smarter people than me, offensive line gurus, to kind of clue me in on what to look for when it comes to offensive line play and different traits and sort of techniques. So this is definitely a group that I'm going to be paying a lot of attention to across all three positions coming up in the next few weeks.
Yeah, looking now, let's transition now to edge rusher. And this is a position that not a lot of people want to talk about, but I think that we need to have a conversation about Nolan Smith out of Georgia. I mean, this is a guy who, before Indy, he was the talk of many people in the scouting community just for his tape, right? He's a guy who sets the edge. He's a guy who's strong as an ox and pushes OTs around. He is a guy who pressures the pocket. He is the guy who's got speed to chase quarterbacks to the sideline. The issues for Nolan Smith, size. He weighed in at 6'2", bulked up to 238 pounds. So that was good. Pass rush refinement. But then he goes and he blows the doors off the combine. Like I said, 6'2", 238, a vert of 41.5, which is the 98th percentile, a broad of 10.8, which is the 95th percentile, a 40-yard dash at 6'2", 238 pounds of 4.44, which is the 98th percentile. This is the kind of guy that you want on your defensive line learning from Von Miller, right? This athletic freak who just needs some refinement. He does everything right. He just needs a pass rush repertoire. And I think the testing sort of matches the tape, and you really have a guy here that you feel comfortable, despite the lack of sack production, drafting and refining. And if he's on the board at 27, I'm not saying he's going to be, because he just screams like Seattle Seahawk, who has like a Seattle Seahawks who's got a pick in the early 20s. But if Nolan Smith is on the board, man, that's tempting if you're the Buffalo Bills.
It's tempting, and this is in a situation, I think, like, who was it? Jason Away a couple years ago, where he was like the athletic freak, and we were like wondering without the sack production.
Yeah.
Right. But this is different, right? Yeah. Because you have the tape with Nolan Smith. He's coming from Georgia. Pete Nana says we can't start the season with so Epinesa and Basham holding the fort. And as much as people don't want to necessarily talk about it, it should be a consideration, right, for this guy to be in play at 27 if he's there. And I'm not saying he's going to be, but like, you need that sort of, in my opinion, the Bills need that sort of archetype that kind of as closely kind of mirrors Von Miller as you can find. No one is Von Miller. He's a unicorn. I get that. But as who was it that just mentioned Hassan Reddick, Charles G, like, you need a speedier edge guy that's a little bit more bendy to kind of go along with these lengthy guys like Rousseau, Epinesa, Basham, because you're not getting any kind of pure pass rush from anyone else on this team as it stands right now, right? You don't have a guy on the team that can do that. So is first round a big investment? Obviously it is, but that's a guy that can come in and play right away and kind of set the table for Von Miller to come back. And then all of a sudden, like, imagining that unit with a healthy Von Miller becomes kind of exciting. People don't want to talk about it, but you can't just write off edge rusher, I think, early for the Bills yet again, even though it seems like this is all we do is take edge rushers early in drafts.
Some other guys that impressed me, Tuli Tuiapolotu from USC kind of has like a little bit of like Zadarius Smith to his game. He slimmed down, lost a ton of weight, but he still tested very well. Will McDonald from Iowa State tested very well. He was used as a 5 technique at Iowa State when he should have been used out on the edge. So he's a guy where you're projecting into the NFL because they were using him wrong in college. Derek Hall which was a name that Bills Mafia became familiar with when Mel Kiper mocked into the Bills in the first round like 3 months ago out of Auburn. He also tested very well. So there are some guys who tested pretty well. Guys like Will McDonald, guys like Derek Hall, guys like Nolan Smith. And then there was also the guy from Northwestern. And Dave, do you want to try to pronounce this guy from Northwestern's name?
Yeah, let me try to get it.
Yeah, you give it a try. But Adeboarie, here's the issue I have, because Adeboarie was the other big riser of the combine, right?
I'm just gonna call him AA.
Yeah, but people like look at him and they're like, well, his tape is like, you see flashes here and there, but his tape's like not the greatest in the world, but he's such a freak. He's such a specimen. You want to get that guy into your room, and that's not who I want to take at pick 27 or even in the second round, right? Like there's a difference between Nolan Smith and that, right? There's a difference between those two things. Will McDonald, I think, would fall into a category I'd feel comfortable with in the first or the second round. Same with the Derek Hall, because you see a little bit more on tape than you do from a guy like Adewariye from Northwestern. Some other fallers, Andre Carter was a huge faller. I think Isaiah Folksy was a faller. There was one other faller that I had in this draft, but I can't quite put my finger on it. But I know Carter dropped a lot. The Army kid he's free falling.
Yeah, I mean, Folksy still tested pretty well, by the way, 9.32 RAS score. But you have guys like Herbig didn't test well from Wisconsin. Caleb Murphy didn't test great. KJ Henry was like below the average. So like, this is the thing with edge, where, the Bills, it's not going to surprise me if they draft an edge at any point during this draft. It wouldn't surprise me at 27. It wouldn't surprise me in round 6. Like, it's a wild card position, I think, for the Bills this year, because there's question marks going into the season yet again. With this position, which it feels like a team that has Super Bowl aspirations. We have a lot of question marks across this roster, and this free agency period and draft is going to be super important.
And Dylan throws Zach Harrison out there as well. Zach Harrison is one of those middle round guys that actually interests me, because I think a lot of times with like a middle round pick, you're like, how much are they going to contribute right away? And if the Buffalo Bills are using a 3rd or a 4th round pick on a defensive end, like, I'd want them to be able to contribute from day one, especially with Von Miller not probably going to be ready to start next season. And a lot of those middle round guys, you're like, it's going to take them a year or two to really get the hang of things. They're just going to blend in with the AJ Epinezas and the Boogie Bastions of the world. I think Zach Harrison could be a little bit different just because of the prestige program he played for in Ohio State. I think KJ Henry could be a little bit different as well, coming from Clemson. So some of those bigger program guys, I don't know if their ceiling is as high as some of those other guys you might draft in the 3rd or the 4th round. Like, they're not going to turn into Max Crosby, right? Like, so you're losing out on that. You're like, oh, I'm drafting them and they might give me some production. They might give me 5-6 sacks, be a good rotational defensive end, but their ceiling ain't Max Crosby. So you're giving up a little bit to get a little, you're giving up a lot possibly in the future to gain in the present. So that's a dangerous game you're playing, but I do like Zach Harrison. I do like KJ Henry.
Yeah. I mean, KJ Henry has played 50 plus games in his career. I mean, he's got almost 150 tackles in his career with Clemson. Played a ton of games, played in a ton of big games, 3rd team All-American last year by PFF after a career year in 2022, started every game, 9 TFL last year. He's got, he's got experience. So a guy that can come in probably in day one and make an impact, right? Make a contribution if you don't take, even if you wait to say late day two to take a guy like that. So
looking at the defensive tackles, Kalijah Cansey, Jalen Redmond, they're the ones who stole the show. They're 3 techs, and I just I don't know where it is. Maybe I'm just still kind of struggling for Ed Oliver and all that stuff. I'm not interested and don't want to talk about 3 techs. And Brian Brzee had a good combine. Cool. Great. 3 tech. The guys I want to talk about are the guys who are going to go in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th rounds, those bigger dudes, the guys who aren't going to test well, the Moro Ijomos of the world, the Keanu Bentons of the world, the Nesta Jade Silveras of the world, the Keandre Coburns of the world, the Jared Clarks of the world, Siaki Ikas of the world, the PJ Mustafers of the world. They're just going to blend in at the combine. They're not going to do anything that really sticks out. The 1 tech, 3 tech sort of guy who could have stood out but decided not to test was Maisie Smith. So all eyes for me are going to be on the Michigan Pro Day, because I think Maisie Smith could test in a way that puts him in play at pick number 27 as a 1 tech, 3 tech sort of hybrid blend.
Yeah, and he is the one guy that you like look at the top end
Mhm.
between guys like Brian Brees. Like these guys aren't going to be available to the Bills. So who's the next guy that could be the one to improve that stock? And that's Maisie Smith, the one,
Mhm.
you look at the size at least before, that he's 6'3", 326. That's a nice size right there. Little bit of a blend, like you said, could be
Mhm.
a little bit of both. But otherwise, I would have to agree with you. Like, I'm not really that interested in kind of talking about these like pure three techs. Keanu Benton's the guy that I really like. I know you like him too.
Yep.
Was at the Senior Bowl. Actually, even a little bit smaller than Maisie Smith, but obviously, all Big Ten third
Mhm.
team in 2022. Played and started all 12 games last year. 10 TFL, 6.5 or 4.5 sacks from that interior position. So really solid stud.
Mhm.
What was it like 2 or 3 years ago? We had like all those one tech guys we liked. Was it like Tonga and Tadaro Slayton and
Mhm.
those guys in that draft
Yeah.
class that were like the 4th, 5th round guys?
Yeah.
I'm kind of with you. Like I'm okay with these guys blending in at the combine.
Mhm.
The combine's not really made for these big fatties, right? Like
Yeah.
it's made for the athletic three techs who
Mhm.
will wow with some of their speed and stuff, but like no one really cares too much about like bench press,
Yeah.
sadly, right? For like the big fatties. Like they all expect these guys to do 20 reps or more, right?
Mhm.
So it's like it's not the best carnival per se for these big fatties, but like I still want one. I still want one.
Oh, 100%. I really do hope the Buffalo Bills take a defensive tackle at some point in the draft. Transitioning now to linebackers, Jack Campbell. He tested really
Mm,
well. A lot of people talked about liking Jack Campbell if Jermaine Evans was to walk in free agency. Despite how well Jack Campbell tested, I am a little concerned though, because if you pop in his RAS and compare it to some other people, Jack Campbell, a middle linebacker, his RAS is close to Leighton Vander Esch, which is kind of promising because Vander Esch has had some really good flashes over the course of his career. But it also is like very similar to TJ Watt. And I can't picture a guy of TJ Watt's athletic profile ever playing middle linebacker. So Jack Campbell is sort of like still to me, despite the fact that he tested well, kind of a question mark.
he's a question mark, and it's the same. It's the same reason why you know. It's the same reason why other guys in this class who tested well. I'm gonna butcher this guy's name. Owen Papoe.
Oh yeah,
Um,
Bruce
would
Feldman's freak list.
freak list, like absolute freak, sideline to sideline speed, football IQ,
Mhm.
leadership, coverage ability. But he's like 6'1", 225, and he
Yep.
played middle linebacker in college. Like, what is that guy gonna be in the pros? Like, if he was like Tremaine Edmonds' size, he'd be like a top 10, top 15
Mhm.
draft pick with that ability, athletic ability. So, like, freak list. What do you do with these guys? What do you do with a guy like Jack Campbell who tested 9.9, RAS,
Mhm.
but like what position is he going to really play middle linebacker in the pros? He didn't have a great 40 time, by the way, but he still tested great
Mhm.
in everything else. So like, what is that sideline to sideline speed really going to be? A lot of that is instinctual. I get it. Good coverage, but like, this is tough, right? And then you have guys like Trenton Simpson, who I know Eric Turner really likes, tested
Mhm.
amazingly well. Probably the consensus top linebacker in this draft, I would think at this point. Where's he going to end up? Is he going to be like a Nakobe Dean or someone like that, where it's like a late first, early second type of player, where that's when you see the
Mhm.
first linebacker go? And if the Bills do lose Tremaine Edmonds, then this position then all of a sudden becomes in play at 27.
Mhm. Yeah. Chris Jenke comes in and says, "Isn't linebacker a position that's a little bit more about instincts and athleticism?" I think you got to blend the both because like you can have all the instincts in the world if you're not a great athlete, you're still going to be limited a ton. So to me, I think you still need to have at least some decent athleticism, and that's why like if you really trust Jack Campbell's instincts, then maybe the testing numbers don't scare you as much that he's a little stiff, etc. Um, you mentioned Trenton Simpson. Of all these linebackers, I don't think any of them outside of Trenton Simpson is in play until pick 59. Like
Yeah.
Trenton Simpson, I think legitimately, like he has, and a number of different people in the scouting community have said that this week. Like, oh, Trenton Simpson, I don't get it. I watched his 2022 tape and I just don't see a first round draft pick. But people are like, no, go turn on the 2021 tape. And then they look at his combine numbers and they look at his 2021 tape and they're like, oh crap, that's a first round prospect. So a guy like Trenton Simpson could rise into the first round based off of older film. He was used differently in 2022 and his combine testing numbers. Simpson is a guy who, if the Bills lose out on Tremaine Edmonds, I think is legitimately in play at pick 27. He's not going to be used in the same way as Tremaine Edmonds. The Buffalo Bills will have to make some changes to their defense. Guys like Jack Campbell, guys like Henley from Washington State, the converted wide receiver. I think he had himself a decent day. Those guys are still in play. I think Campbell raised his stock into the second round, maybe early third round. I don't think we could get him all the way at the back end of the third round. And I think Henley has sort of secured himself in the day two as well. And a guy who's really moved up too is Dorian Williams from Tulane. Mm-hmm. He had a really big combine. Heard his name a lot. I think Noah Sewell is going to drop just because that lack of athleticism, the fact that he's just really not a fit for a lot of teams in this day and age. Dylan says Drew Sanders. I don't know, man. Like, not a lot of dropping back passing. He's more of a guy that you might want to be like an undersized edge in a 34, more so than like a middle linebacker. So a lot of questions there about Drew Sanders, but a good prospect for what he does. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens at the linebacker position. Somebody else mentioned Demarion Overshown as well. Demarvion Overshown as well from Texas. He's a guy who had a solid day. I've never really been the biggest fan of Overshown, but he made some leaps in 2022 and that Texas defense got better. I still do think that he's a little sleek, a little slender for the NFL. So he's going to need to boost up his play strength. And, I don't think he's very good in like run defense and sort of like getting off blocks. So things like that are things you're going to want to watch out for on a guy like Overshown. I think he's a day 3 guy, but it'll be interesting. And then Charles G says Ivan Pace, who I've always liked. I would just designate Ivan Pace as a pass rusher. I would never play him as a linebacker, but that's sort of like my hot take of draft season. Any final thoughts on these linebackers before we move it on over to cornerback?
Same thing. Same goes for Yasir Abdullah for me. I give him the Ivan Pace treatment, edge rusher, bendy linebacker type. Another, he kind of seems like that athletic, sort of freaky, like, could you put him at linebacker? Can you put him at edge type guy? So I'll throw him into the Ivan Pace mix as well. But no, I think you hit it with everybody else.
Yeah, corners were, I think, rising in Indy, and we had this conversation last week. The more corners that rise, the better. Yep. Jacorian Bennett from Maryland with his 4.3 40 really jumped off the board to people. Deonte Banks with his 4.35, I think, could have gone from a second rounder to a first rounder. DJ Turner, I think, really solidified himself as a second rounder with his 4.26 40. Emmanuel Forbes, he checked the boxes. Keely Ringo, he checked the boxes. A guy who a lot of people were calling a sleeper, Darius Rush from South Carolina, rose up draft boards, had a 4.36 40. Christian Gonzalez checked a lot of boxes. Despite his small stature, some of the best tape you'll see of a corner is Travius Hodges Tomlinson, nephew of LaDainian Tomlinson. He is sort of like, maybe, I'm not going to say he's Marcus Jones because he's not that freaky athlete, but he's that super undersized corner who you just love. Hodges Tomlinson is going to be that guy this year. Maybe he can sneak into day 2. The more guys, Catriel Clark had a good Shrine Bowl, tested really well. Cam Smith tested really well. Riley Moss tested really well. Tyreek Stevenson tested really well. Joey Porter Jr. tested really well. Man, if only the Buffalo Bills needed a corner this year. But
it's like a blessing in disguise, right?
Yeah,
because
I just named
more guys.
I just named like 20 dudes here, and they could all go on like the first 3 rounds of the draft, and that leaves other guys at other positions dropping to the Buffalo Bills. So like, this is an amazing draft class. I think if anyone sort of had a bad day, it was probably Clark Phillips. Like he sort of like had a slower 40. A lot of people were a little unimpressed with him. So that'll be interesting. I thought Jay Ward working with the corners was interesting. We're going to talk about him in a moment when it comes to safeties. But just a really good cornerback class that we're just not going to spend. Last year, this time we would have spent 45 minutes on these corners.
Oh yeah. What was it? seven guys under a 4.4 40.
Yeah,
like
just
most ever, something like that. Some kind of record, I think, for corners, like, which is fine, right? At this stage, it's like, okay, we can finally not have the conversation of drafting a corner in round 1. Watch like the Bills go and draft a corner.
And like, draft, who's a corner that could drop? Probably not Weatherspoon, probably not Gonzalez, probably not. Draft Deontay Banks in the first round and move Trey White to free safety. Like, not going to happen, but like, who knows? Like, it's certain, like the Bills could just shock you with a move of that nature. And that could be like the shock of the first round. I'm like, I'll put it at like a 5% chance, but it's still a possibility. On to the safety class, which Bills need a safety this year. And so sure enough, we get to Indy and the safety class insanely underwhelms. Obviously, Brian Branch is Brian Branch. Sidney Brown tested very well, probably solidified himself. He's another guy who might go in the first 10 picks of the second round. He's really tested himself into that range. I think Antonio Johnson kept himself in the second round. But I'll tell you what, like they even made a comment. It was Charles Davis said the second group of safeties that were working out, like the position coaches were even like yelling at them because they didn't even like their energy. They tested slow. I tried to sort of fan the flames a little bit. Like, of course, safeties are going to test slow. If they tested fast, they're cornerbacks. Like, you expect safeties to test a little bit slower. But I mean, Chris Smith's RAS was really not great. It was like a 1.93 or something like that. So Christopher Smith, who both of us are high on, we've talked about as a third round guy. I've even heard some people like, oh, no, he's a second round guy. He's a second round guy. To me, with those testing numbers, I don't feel comfortable taking that guy on day 2. He's now early day 3 guy to me, like 4th round, you pull the trigger on a Chris Smith. But that's sort of the jockeying that's happening in Indy. Mm-hmm. Other guys like Jamie Robinson, I think, probably did enough to keep themselves late day 2, early day 3. Brandon Joseph was like, he's probably late day 2, early day 3. Same with Jordan Battle. Maybe even Jordan Battle moves up a little bit. Who are some safeties that like sort of stuck out to you? I know your guy, JL Skinner, did not get a chance to work out.
JL Skinner did not.
He was injured. He was injured, by the way. I don't know if you knew that or not, but
yep. I mean, so the Florida guy is not super impressive. A lot of people like Trey Dean didn't think he was like super impressive. Well, I know we're talking about guys that we like. Obviously, Sidney Brown is the guy for me. Stock up on him. I went back and tried to look at when this morning when it was the first time I kind of like tweeted about him was back in January. He tested really well. Like probably in round 2 pick if someone really needs a safety at this point, like you mentioned. So he raised his stock. Chamari Connor raised his stock. I felt with that 9.44 RAS tested really well as Connor was a guy that, as far as even, let me look at this, my notes here. As recently as February 2nd, so just over a month ago, TDN only had Chamari Connor ranked as their 337 overall prospect. So he then goes out and tests well with the 9.94 RAS. I think he made himself some money. I don't know exactly where that slots him in as far as but he's not 337, right? Like he's going to be drafted. So he helped his case. You mentioned Antonio Johnson, Christopher Smith, and Jamie Robinson. Like to me, Jamie Robinson did not test well, 4.89 RAS. But we still both like him, I think, to where like maybe that's a good thing because the safety class like maybe needs to be a jumbled mess for the Bills to potentially get their guy, because if a couple guys separate themselves and kind of distinguish themselves, maybe that doesn't leave the Bills in a position to get the guy they want. So, maybe that's a good thing that some of these guys didn't necessarily test so great.
Yeah. Ralph Wilson Sr. comes in and says, bad safety class will drive up prices in the free agent market. The safeties tested on like Thursday, Friday, and then all of a sudden you hear on Saturday, Sunday reports that like Mike Epps of Philadelphia Eagles is going to be like an under the radar, highly paid free agent, right? Like, so you start to see things like that. Guys I thought really ding their stock, Rashad Torrance and Trey Dean.
Oh yeah. Both Florida guys stunk. They stunk.
Jair Brown from Penn State, I think, tanked his stock a little bit, even though I know a lot of guys still like him, like Claude Puig. Like I wouldn't touch Jair Brown until the 6th round. I don't know. I've never understood why anyone thought he was higher than a 6th round pick. Like, don't get me wrong. If you do think he's higher than a 6th round pick, to each their own. I've never had him higher than like a 6th round grade, and the combine has done nothing really to sort of make me move that. I have a 7th round grade on a Jair Brown, but you mentioned Chamari Connor, Tyreek Jones, I think had a good combine from Boise State. The other guy who goes along with JL Skinner, some guys who I thought really raised their stock. Daniel Scott from Cal, I thought had a good combine to go along with some solid tape. Jay Ward from
Yeah.
LSU.
Jay
And I
Ward,
think a guy who might have moved his way into late day two, Brandon Hill from Pitt, right? So
yep, I agree with that.
5'10, 193, 4'4", 40. People always seem to like his tape. I think a guy like Brandon Hill from Pitt might have worked his way up and really elevated himself in the jockeying of position at the safety spot. So it'll be interesting to see how these guys all fall. I still like Kayvon Merriweather. I sort of fell in love with the story of Jordan Howden, walk on at Minnesota. He's the guy who had the green dot. He had a pretty solid combine there, in Indy. So a guy like Jordan Howden is now on my radar as well. Kayvon Merriweather saved himself. He had a 4.740 the first time, went around the second time, had a 4.62. I didn't look at his RAS. It's probably not great. Kayvon Merriweather, just the worse he does testing wise, the further he falls down the draft boards, the more I think you're going to get a steal later on in the draft. And then there were a couple of guys who popped off, like Jason Taylor, the second from Oklahoma State. He popped off, but he's a guy where he had really good testing numbers, but you go and you look at the scouting reports and people just really don't like his game all that much. And there was Martin from Illinois, but now people think he's more of a nickel corner. So it'll be really interesting to see. And I'm still on the Keely Ringo to safety train too. So if the Buffalo Bills think Keely Ringo's a guy at pick 27,
I will say this, and maybe just due to the lack of good testing, but I kind of now I'm liking Kayvon Merriweather more than I used to. So I'm gonna get on board on that train with you because out of all these guys and watching some of them, I didn't really think he hurt his stock, honestly, even though he didn't test that great. I just felt like, okay, this guy has good tape and, he tested okay, not the best athletic testing, but good tape, and class isn't maybe super talented. So yeah, give me some Kayvon Merriweather.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that will just about do it for us this evening as we have walked through. We're not going to talk about the kickers and punters. We're not about that life this year. We spent too much time last year, so it's going to be a while before we get into that conversation again. But things are picking up steam here. A lot of Buffalo Bills news is going to be coming down the pipes this week, so make sure you're turned into all the various different Cover One shows. I guarantee you Josh Allen gets his contract, restructured this week. I guarantee you a couple other moves happen this week. I think the Buffalo Bills will free up some of that money heading into free agency, and then the tampering period starts next Monday. So the Buffalo Bills will be here on Monday night talking about all the guys who get released between now and Monday. We'll be breaking down any of the Buffalo Bills news, whether it's contract restructurings, contract restructurings, what our salary cap situation looks like. We'll be talking about that next Monday. And then we'll be diving in with our final sort of, I don't even want to call it a free agency preview because we might even have a couple of Buffalo Bills free agents to talk about on Monday
news,
night. Yeah. So it should be really interesting unless someone pulls a JD McKissick. So it'll be really interesting. Any final thoughts before we head out of here tonight, Dave?
Look, I mean, I said it multiple times. Combine's just one piece of the equation. What I really like to do at this stage of the process is go ahead, take a look at the combine numbers, go back and kind of either reconfirm some things I had already thought by watching some of these games from these guys, or take a look at some guys that maybe I hadn't had a look at before who kind of burst onto the scene at the combine to see if it really kind of matches up with what they did in games. So just one piece of the equation, but it's still fun nonetheless to kind of stack these guys up against each other.
Yeah, 100%. And ladies and gentlemen, if you missed any part of this show, you simply rewind. You can watch any part of this show on demand. I'll make sure to get in here tonight and timestamp it for you at your own convenience. Leave a comment in the comment section. Talk about a player you like, a prospect you like, any questions you might have for us. Throw it in the comment section. Not the live feed. We've answered those sort of for the night for the most part, but into the comment section. Helps us with the algorithm, and we'll make sure to get back to you. Smash that like before you head out. And as always, if you are someone who prefers to possibly listen to this show, make sure you head on over to Air Raid Buffalo. Follow us on, Apple iTunes, Spotify, Amazon Music, etc. And you can listen to us there. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And until next time, go Bills.
Go Bills.